Hello, everyone. This is just a brief overview of some of the key concepts and terms in in Chapter 1. And in this chapter, uh, the concepts surrounding social inequality and the concepts that contribute to social inequality are the focus. And so first, when we need to consider that social inequality is something that probably all of us have seen or even experienced ourselves. However, for sociologists, we like to be specific with definitions, not just, okay, everybody knows what it is, but here's the definition of what it is. So with social inequality, there is a condition, it's a situation in which not only individuals but families and members of larger social structures in neighborhoods and cities, um, their, their access to valued resources such as wealth, income, education, healthcare, jobs varies depending upon personal characteristics, either of the individuals, the families, or other members of society. And so these things are unequally distributed. Wealth is unequally distributed. Income, education, access at least to quality education is unequally distributed. Healthcare and jobs. So when we think about social stratification, though, because social inequality is different from social stratification, I know that sometimes people use these two terms interchangeably, but they are not interchangeable. As I said, social inequality is referring really to the unequal distribution of whatever prized resources there are within a society, whereas social stratification is more a deeply embedded hierarchy that provides people in those different categories particular rewards, resources, privileges, and even access to relationships that determine and legitimate the outcomes that they have. So I want you to consider that when we think about social stratification, we're usually thinking about how people are divided into groups based on their social class, whether they're working class, poor, middle class, lower middle income, upper class, etc., social class. Also, race or ethnic identity plays a role in this stratification as well. And then gender, gender identity, sexual identity, gender expression. These also play a role in how we see people's outcomes within their society that they live in. So, for example, while we tend to think, okay, well, if you're poor, that just means then you live in a poor neighborhood, you go to schools that maybe don't provide the greatest education, and when you graduate, you probably don't go to college, and therefore you have access to certain kinds of jobs. And it seems natural, perhaps, or normal that this is the progression of how things go. However, that's not necessarily a natural progression. It is a progression based upon how our society operates, but that doesn't necessarily make it natural. Men typically, even men of color, have better access to resources and power and opportunities, and yes, even some privileges that women do not have. I mean, here's one privilege, and we'll talk more about privilege in some of the later chapters, but just think about this privilege. It doesn't have anything to do with social stratification, but it is a privilege, one that men have that women do not. Men have the privilege of being able to work late at night and walk to their cars in a dark parking lot or an empty parking lot. They have the privilege of being able to go for a run at night without having to think about whether they might be in danger. They have the privilege of going to a bar on their own without really thinking too much about, hey, is somebody going to try to pick up on me or, sexually assault me, etc. Men also have the privilege of not really worrying at all about getting pregnant because they can't. On the other hand, women don't have those privileges. Women have to think about these things. We have to think about where we are, if it's safe for us to be out at night, to go running at night, which is something I like to do when it's hot, run at night, because it's just kind of a cool thing to do. It's cooler at night too. Also, when we go to a bar by ourselves, we're constantly thinking about, well, is this a safe environment for me? That's an example of privilege. Okay, just because it happens doesn't mean that it's normal and that we should leave it unchanged. That's the point I'm trying to make about not just assuming that things because they operate in a particular way are normal. And then we have the American ideology. Okay, now first off, an ideology is simply a system of values or beliefs that support a particular idea within society, a certain way in which social institutions operate within a particular society. So when we think about the American ideology, it's really this idea that whether or not we are successful in our lives is all up to us as individuals, right? We're supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We are supposed to work hard and go to school and do all these things in order to be successful. And therefore, people who are not successful must not have done all the things they were supposed to do. However, the reality is this, that our social institutions, from education all the way through our political systems, our economic systems, etc. All of these things that are part of our social institutions and how our society operates, they have worked for a very long time to produce the social inequalities and social stratification. Remember that most of these systems, whether we're talking about education, healthcare, our economic system, our political system, etc., these were all created by white people for white people. I'm not saying that these institutions are bad or evil or wrong simply because they were created for white people by white people. What I am suggesting, though, is that these systems have a long way to go before they really work to serve all members of society rather than just the people for whom they were created, because they were created by those individuals. Globalization is another term that we're going to hear and read about quite a bit in this particular course. And globalization really refers to how interdependent nations are in terms of producing goods as well as exporting goods, but also importing goods from other countries. So if you've been paying any attention to the news recently, there's a lot of focus on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, precisely because Russia sells a lot of gas, natural gas, to various European countries. Well, some of these countries would like to support Ukraine and stop buying natural gas from Russia. However, if they do that, then they're going to have an issue about where they're going to get natural gas, because the biggest provider closest to them is Russia. And all the pipelines are already there, they're existing, and so this creates a problem. Those European countries, as much as they want to support Ukraine by boycotting the Russian oil, doing so means that their own residents may not have access to the natural gas they need. The other thing about globalization is we have seen over the last 40 years or so that corporations that used to be based solely in the United States, they have become multinational corporations, which means that they've set up factories in other countries and hire people in those countries to do the work. Why? Because there's usually not quite as many regulations that they have to fulfill if they operate in these other countries, and also the labor tends to be cheaper. Okay? So they're called multinational corporations because they may be based in the US, but they have operations, factories in other countries producing their goods and shipping them back to the US. And then, of course, the global economy is one that I think all of us can understand, because we constantly are buying things from other countries, whether it's our government buying oil and gas from the Arab nations, or whether it's ourselves perhaps buying, well, I don't have any of this stock, and maybe you don't either, but stock of Alibaba or other Chinese stocks, or maybe buying, I don't know, something that another country produces that we like. I'm not sure what that might be. But yeah, global economy. If you like the, K-pop, right? That's a huge thing right now in the United States. And so some people are buying the commodity of concerts, going to K-pop concerts. The Gini index is not something I'm going to test you on in a written exam, but it is a question, just heads up, it is a question on that first quiz. And the reason I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it is because the Gini index is fairly complex. It's not quite clear how the data is computed, what kind of algorithms are used to produce this score. The Gini index is a score that a country is assigned based upon how much inequality it has. And according to the Gini index, the U.S. has more economic inequality than 23 other developed nations, which, if you pay attention to what's going on, shouldn't really surprise you that much. So it's probably easier to just think about what is the percentage of national income in a particular country that goes to the wealthy segment versus the poor segment. So if you think about the United States, the wealthiest 1% of people living in the United States control about 90% of the wealth and resources in this country. That means all the other social classes are dividing that other 10%. So you can see that we have quite a bit of social inequality in the U.S. Here are some interesting terms, and I want you to consider them as we move through this. I want you to think about how these play into perhaps explaining your own situation at whatever point you are in your life today. Social reproduction is a term created by sociologists to refer to the way in which the characteristics that people have and the categories, particularly social class, that people belong in, may give them different access to resources that will then mean that they can either better their own circumstances and that of their children, or at least provide a situation where their children can prosper and then their children's children. We know, or I think many of you know, that one of the strongest indicators of social reproduction is education. The more educated parents are, the better their opportunities and access to resources their children have. It means, of course, that parents who are college educated or maybe even have a graduate degree, they have a lot of information that they then can provide to their children. There tends to be, according to studies, more parental involvement by these parents. They also tend to have more money to provide access to resources that other parents don't. I mean, these are parents who typically make more money because they have education, so they can pay for music lessons for their child. They can enroll their child or children in after-school sports programs. They can perhaps send their child abroad to study abroad while the child is in college. They can hire tutors. They can hire college advisors or people who specialize in helping children of middle class and wealthier folks to get into the colleges of their dreams. All of this is something that if you have parents who are not college educated, they certainly cannot provide. Okay, they just don't have the money, they don't have the knowledge about what's out there. It's not that they don't want to help their children, they just don't know what's out there and available to help their children. Habitas, nice fancy word, which is just referencing the set of attitudes, behavior, and experiences that people who live in a particular social world have, right? So they think a certain way, they act a certain way, they seek out certain kinds of experiences that perhaps people in a different social world don't. Here's an example. If you come from the middle class, you probably went on, a summer vacation. You maybe also were able to take music lessons and play sports. And even playing sports in school means that you have to have some money because you've got to buy the equipment, whether that's cleats if you're running track, or the pads in the helmet if you're playing football, etc. On the other hand, people who are very wealthy, their set of attitudes, their behavior, their experiences are going to be different. They send their children not just to public schools or private schools, but they send their children to elite private schools. These are private schools that many of you have never even heard of. These are private schools where children are boarded, meaning that they, from an early age, get sent away to go to these schools. They live at these schools. It's almost like being in college, but you're a kid. They have the ability to hire tutors, etc. They have the ability to go on ski vacations and, go to private islands and, all kinds of things. Habitas is really just referring to the different kinds of attitudes, behaviors, and experiences that people have when they're in these very distinct social worlds. And one thing to note about social reproduction is that it can change. And I'm an example of that. I grew up in a family. I'm 7 of 9 kids. My parents were immigrants from Mexico. They didn't have any education. They didn't graduate from high school. They had some elementary school education, but that was about it. Having said that, they were not dumb. They were hard workers. And I was able to go to some good public schools in California. I am 60, so times have changed since then. But though I grew up in a low-income home, I did have excellent education, or at least good education. And so I was able to, because I had a college counselor who pushed me and gave me the information, I was able to apply to and get accepted into Stanford University and go there right out of high school. And so that means that my experiences have been very much unlike those of my parents because of that ability to get a quality education at the K through 12 level and then go to a prestigious college. I want us to focus on capital because sociologists, we talk about capital quite often. We may talk about financial capital, human capital, cultural capital, social capital, and these are all capital. If you think about it, it's resources that people have, right? And they can acquire them. Sometimes we're born with them, but they're these resources that we have access to. And not everybody has access to all 4 of them. Some people do, some people do not. So let's take a look at them. Here they are summarized in this cool little chart. Cultural capital is really focused, and it's a concept that was created by a sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu talks about cultural capital in this way. He argues that depending upon the parents that we have, we then have either more or less cultural capital. And when he talks about cultural capital, he's talking about what are the things about our culture, the culture we grow up in, that are acceptable to the larger culture, that are prized by the larger society. So when he talks about cultural capital, he's talking really about how if you know how to speaking proper English, for example, is part of cultural capital. It's the ability to speak proper English. It's the ability to know when to use it, that children who are middle class and above learn very early on. You can speak any way you want to, but when you're in certain situations, this is how you are supposed to talk because you want to be viewed by others in a particular way. Another form of cultural capital is knowing what the norms and the values are of the larger society. So knowing that when you go to a job interview, you should look the interviewer in the eye, you should appear interested, you should nod, you should ask questions, all of those things. That's part of cultural capital because that's something that the larger society accepts and expects. So children who lack that cultural capital, who don't understand that in certain social environments you're supposed to act a certain way or dress a certain way, etc., they may not have access to some of the resources and opportunities that kids who have more cultural capital do have. Social capital is more about how much access to resources parents and perhaps peers and teachers or others in the child's social environment, how much access to resources others can help provide. So here's an example of social capital that I have, and I don't have any children, but if I had, here's some social capital I could have shared with my child. Let's say that I have a child who is in college and is finishing up her junior year of college, and so she's telling me, hey, I think I want to go to law school. So because I am a lawyer and I know lawyers, I tell her, okay, well, let me make some calls and let me find out if perhaps one of the people I know works in a law firm where they're hiring interns this summer at the law office. And so I make those calls, and because I am a lawyer and I am not poor, I'm able to also offer my child the ability not to have to work. And so if the internship is unpaid, that's okay. So eventually I get some yeses from a couple of people I know, and they say, have your daughter send her resume to me. I'll pass it on to the person who's hiring interns and put in a good work. And lo and behold, my daughter gets an internship for the summer. Okay. That's social capital, being able to use the resources I have to provide more resources for my offspring or for people that I know. Human capital. Human capital is about your own unique skills, your own personal characteristics. And we all have a set of unique skills, abilities. We all have knowledge that we've attained over the years given our different experiences in school and education. And so that human capital is something that we have within us. It's not something other people necessarily give us or we learn from them, as in cultural capital or social capital where people give it to us. It's something that we have internally, but it's also something that can be fostered by the people around us. So people can tell us how smart we are and how skilled we are, etc. And that will mean that if we have those skills, that human capital, then we begin to believe in it even more and we feel quite confident using that human capital. Financial capital, this is much easier to understand. It's about how much access to wealth and income you and or your family have. And that, of course, means that that will play a role in where we live, what kind of a community we live in. Is it working class? Is it middle class? Is it upper class? What kind of school do we go to? What kind of experiences we have? What kind of extracurricular and co-curricular activities we engage in? All of them. So, and then just, that's the stuff I just went over. Sometimes you might hear political capital as another term. Won't focus too much on that, but sometimes when we use our social capital in the political realm, that means that we perhaps decide, hey, I'm going to run for mayor of my town. Well, if we have a lot of social capital, because we've done a lot of social networking, we know a lot of people, we belong to different groups and organizations, and we're successful in our job, etc. Well, we use that social capital and we turn it into political capital. All right, so that is it for this chapter, and I will see you for the next one.